The Second Crusade has failed, but its end will open the door to the Plantagenets, that brilliant, avaricious, rebellious, murderous family that will dominate the history of Western Europe for a century to come. Here's their story, so riveting that we still are fascinated by it 900 years later.
Welcome back to Lion's Forge. My name is Beckett, and I want to tell you a story. An epic, true story of 5 kings and the Lion Queen. Season 2, Episode 19. All is Tumult. On May Day, 1185, an eclipse of the sun shrouded what should have been a lovely spring day in Northern Europe. It was followed by an earthquake in England, the first in a century. Bad enough to rattle nerves in Norway, 750 miles away. The quake crumbled the center of prosperous Lincoln, terrifying the citizens, wrecking the little houses and ruining the century-old cathedral, splitting it from top to bottom, which had to be an ominous sign of God's wrath. We don't know if anyone died, although some probably did. A shocking kind of death, completely outside the experience of anyone on that green island. People struggled with their consciences. What had they done so wrong in a year that had started so splendidly? The English had been dazzled back in January by the arrival of an extraordinary delegation from the Holy Land, led by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, and the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller. The group had stopped first, as travelers often did, at the Becket Shrine at Canterbury, before heading to meet great Henry Plantagenet. 40 years before, a similar group had gone to Rome to beg the Pope for help against the Saracens. Now, these distinguished men, solemn with responsibility, came to England to talk to the English king. The ambassador's trip, tough months on the road, had come at the behest of the King of Jerusalem, young Baldwin IV, the so-called Leper King, a cousin of Henry's. The distinguished diplomatic mission was straightforward. The years since the failure of the Second Crusade had not been kind to the Outremer, at least not if you were a Christian. That failed crusade had inspired Muslims with both ambition and confidence, newly allied with an exceptional leader whose name we still remember, Saladin. The warrior prince, 48 years old, had spent decades deploying his armies from Egypt to Syria to defeat rivals in the field, while simultaneously displaying the diplomatic skill to bring together a rare constellation of economic and political allies. Saladin and his coalition was a potent threat to the Outremer. Baldwin of Jerusalem, king of the most powerful, prized, and thus important of the Latin states, looked west to his European cousin for help. Baldwin, only in his 20s, was not a happy man. He'd been heroic in the defense of Jerusalem against Saladin back in 1177, but his disease drove him down and down, weakening him as he fought Muslim attacks from the outside and incessant political rivalries that tore at his country from within. The King of Jerusalem was indeed a leper, mortally ill with a disease that could make a young man unable to feel a burning torch against his palm. Even today, we're not sure why someone gets leprosy, seemingly as much bad luck as anything else. Baldwin, a young man who should have been in the prime of his life, probably had no eyebrows. His fingers would be hugely swollen. The poor man was also going blind. Worst of all, his ability to sire a child was fatally compromised, making the long-term stability of the entire kingdom, the key European stronghold in the Holy Land, nerve-wrackingly uncertain. Struggles to dominate the succession had already started. Baldwin needed powerful support, and thought to turn to cousin Henry, the monarch who bestrode the world. Thus Baldwin's impressive embassy to England, the patriarch gravely presenting Henry with the keys to Jerusalem, that holiest of cities, asking that the king return them to Baldwin at the head of a new crusader army. Given Baldwin's likely lifespan, the Plantagenet king even had reason to contemplate the prospect of eventually ruling Jerusalem itself. Indeed, although no one yet had word of it in England, Baldwin had already died, not long after his delegates left for Europe. Henry himself had talked about a crusade for the better part of 20 years, and Becket's death had spurred penitential promises to take an army off to the east. However, when all was said and done, Henry never actually took those promises seriously enough to go. Now, in light of the plea from Baldwin, Henry called a council of his barons and bishops at Clerkenwell, a neighborhood of London, in March 1185, asking their advice. Given the gloomy shadow still cast by the Second Crusade, the issue required little deliberation. To Henry's probable relief, the unanimous response was, "Don't do it." The splendor of the embassy from Jerusalem may have influenced the outcome, although not in the way Baldwin intended. Undoubtedly arranged to demonstrate the vast importance Baldwin placed on the mission, it went awry. Disgruntled Londoners felt that a prince that rich had little need of help. The ambassadors received this decision morosely, asking why Prince John, at the very least, couldn't be spared as a symbol of Henry's support for his beleaguered cousin. Henry would have none of it. He sent his beloved baby, now 18, with some 60 shiploads of Plantagenet minions off to Ireland, while the disappointed travelers from Jerusalem headed back across the whole of Europe. The eclipse and earthquake came soon thereafter. So it was Ireland, neglected by Henry for years, rather than the Outremer, that now rejoined the Plantagenet drama. You might recall that Henry had named his youngest boy Lord of Ireland, to make up for John's shortage of things to rule back when John had become betrothed to Isabel of Gloucester, daughter of the powerful Fitzrobert family. Now Henry used Ireland to dodge the prospect of sending John to fight, and possibly die, in the Holy Land. Unfortunately, it became apparent rather quickly that Henry's decision to let his youngest boy rule the island was spectacularly misplaced. Not only was he a thoroughly inept army commander when faced with even the slightest resistance, John also proved an adolescent bully, blighting whatever tenuous sparks of warmth and amity had slowly built between the Irish and Henry's people since Strongbow's day. Greedy John even tried to play the miser with his mercenaries so he could keep their payroll for himself, a decision which painfully backfired when they all deserted to the Irish. The prince and his entourage had to be hustled home mere months after their arrival to avoid a full-scale Irish insurrection. Compounding the disaster, Henry decided that the fault lay not in his dear son, but in an inadequate title. John, who failed so abysmally as Lord, might do better as King of Ireland. The Pope's blessing was duly sought and obtained for this new junior orb in the European sky. While Henry labored to turn his untalented boy into a king, the persistently unstable relations among the rest of the family were unraveling again. The reason this time was a fight between Richard and Geoffrey, who were finding it impossible to work together in Normandy. As usual, there was every prospect that Richard would whip his younger brother. Rather than letting nature take its course, Henry stepped in, this time coming up with the remarkable idea that Richard was to return all of the Aquitaine to Eleanor as surety for his promise to make peace with his brother. The queen was accordingly released from prison, on the bizarre condition that she was to ravage the land with a great host, if Richard didn't abide by his oath. The idea that Eleanor of Aquitaine would make war on her own people, people of her very blood, sounds ludicrous to our ears. But the incredible threat worked. Richard backed down. Perhaps her delight at being free for a while touched his heart, for Richard did love his mother as much as she loved him. Or perhaps Eleanor persuaded him that no rational end could be gained by disobeying his aging father. After all, he would outlive the old man, and he would still be her heir, preferably of a country known for its wealth and beauty, rather than its burned barns and desolate fields. No sooner had this problem simmered down than came hastily messengered word of a new twist in the family fortunes. Prince Geoffrey, second youngest of the Plantagenet boys, overlord of Brittany, was dead in Paris. He was 27, not old, not even ill. No one is quite sure to this day what happened. One story says he was accidentally trampled at a tournament and died of his injuries. Another maintains that he died of that classic 12th century malady, acute indigestion, which could mean anything from food poisoning to a burst appendix. Historian Martin Arl blames a summer cold. Not only don't we know why Geoffrey died, we don't know why he was in Paris, when everyone thought he was home in Brittany. Given his temperament and reputation, no one ever much liked Geoffrey, who was said to be so two-faced he could corrupt kingdoms with his tongue. There were suspicions he was in Paris meeting secretly with Philip Augustus over Geoffrey's willingness to pull Brittany from the Plantagenet universe and turn it over to a lord more congenial than the prince's father, namely the young French king. This deal, if there was one, supposedly would in turn make Geoffrey the powerful seneschal of France, a prospect he might arguably prefer to being a mere third son with nothing but chilly Brittany as his portion in life. Philip certainly seemed desolate in the wake of Geoffrey's death, burying the Plantagenet prince with royal honor in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, ahead of any instructions from Geoffrey's family. There's even a story that the French king had to be physically stopped from throwing himself into the open grave. Yet no matter how grief-stricken, Philip summoned the strength to announce that he, as liege lord of the deceased Duke of Brittany, would assume guardianship of Geoffrey's 4-year-old daughter and heiress, another little Eleanor. Brittany was a pawn, nothing more, but it had just been captured from the startled Henry, and the French were rapidly moving it off the board. People thought back to the early days of Philip Augustus's reign, when he'd been no more than 17 or 18, but already possessed the audacity to tell his counselors that he wanted to restore his country to the grandeur of Charlemagne's time. Frenchmen saw their easy win in Brittany and smiled. And Henry, once graced with 5 possible heirs, had only 2 left, Richard and John. He also had himself yet another war. The Plantagenets were not at all predisposed to lose Brittany. All efforts to negotiate an acceptable settlement of the country's uncertain future failed entirely. If anything, the situation became more tangled as the talks went on. Philip kept adding agenda items that had to be resolved, like the unhappy situation of Princess Alice's wedding, stubbornly stalled for years. A wedding and children meant inheritance rights, which risked a potential French claim down the road to lands Henry had no intention of losing. Getting Alice married accomplished nothing from Henry's perspective. He continued to stall. Well, Philip wouldn't go to war for her. Her fiancé Richard, 30 years old by now and still wifeless, did nothing to help her. Entirely stymied, Elise, powerless Elise, could only sit and watch her life trickle past. Rather than Elise and a glorious royal wedding, it was a comparatively obscure princess who took the world by surprise. Prince Geoffrey's widow Constance, pregnant when her husband died, gave birth to a baby boy. Dynastic calculations were suddenly flipped on their head. This new heir to Brittany was also a potential heir to the entire Plantagenet Empire. Pointedly named Arthur after the legendary folk hero rather than any living relative, the baby was Geoffrey's son. Geoffrey had stood behind Richard, but ahead of John in the line of succession. The Normans weren't overly impressed by that claim, but the Angevins took it quite seriously, making Arthur a potential competitor to both of his living uncles, not to mention any cousins who might yet be born. Philip Augustus promptly pounced on the baby, claiming the infant as a ward of the French crown, bringing him into his own household, and promising he'd eventually marry him to his only daughter. Enough was enough for the Plantagenets. Everyone snapped their visors, pulled on gauntlets, and prepared to battle it out. Henry sent Richard and John, the only remaining adult Plantagenet heirs, off to fight side by side, which seems rather an odd decision. But it turned out that there wasn't all that much fighting to be done. Various efforts went on every day to end this new quarrel before it got entirely out of hand. An eventual truce was negotiated by Richard, of all people. Richard, who loved war and spent virtually his entire life fighting someone. Perhaps he took care of the problem of Brittany to free himself to focus on his next move. Within weeks, Richard grabbed the treasury of Anjou and used it to start sprucing up his Aquitanian castles. And so life went on, chaotic and unpredictable, alliances created or snapped in two with every dawning of a new day. Then, in the fall and early winter of 1187-1188, truly catastrophic news seemed everywhere at once. Stars and planets fell into rare patterns, some not seen since the birth of Christ. There were eclipses, scaring anyone glancing up at the sky, although we should take a moment to note that not everyone in the Middle Ages was as troubled by supposed mysteries in the sky as we tend to think. A monk known as Richard of Devizes sniffed in 1191. People marveled that in the middle of the day the sun's brightness was dimmed, even though it was not obscured by clouds. Such people do not understand the causes of things. Those who study the way the universe works say that eclipses tell us nothing about the future. All of this heavenly disarray was accompanied by killing gales across Europe, shipwrecks, bad harvests, sickness. Then, shouting messengers pounded in with word from the neglected Outremer. In the 2 years since Baldwin's death and the failure of his embassy, the Lusignan family, the same Aquitanian barons who had jumped Eleanor's entourage years before, had maneuvered their way to Jerusalem's highly unstable throne. Now the news of the Lusignan king, Guy, was terrible. He had just fought an historic battle with the Saracens at a place called the Horns of Hattin. It was a Christian bloodbath. Guy himself had been captured and taken off to a Saracen prison. The true cross, the greatest of all Christian relics, had been carried on to that desperate battlefield. It, too, had been lost to infidel hands. These awful tidings had barely been digested in Europe before even more catastrophic news tumbled across the Mediterranean. Jerusalem itself was gone. The holiest city in the Christian world captured by triumphant Muslims. Frightened people remembered what the astrologers had been saying since Jupiter and Saturn had joined in the skies that spring. Dreadful forces were loose in the world. Squabbling between the Plantagenets and the Capets, and even between the Plantagenets and the Plantagenets, took an immediate back seat to the papacy's call for a new crusade, messengers racing down the old Roman roads. Men poured into the streets. The first European noble to respond was Richard, who took the cross at Tours. Philip Augustus, and even Henry himself, were not far behind. Both kings signed on, Henry without calling his usual council to debate the decision. Always exquisitely attuned to the state of his finances, Henry immediately implemented an innovative new tax, the so-called Saladin tithe, which required every man in the Plantagenet Empire to contribute a tenth of the value of all personal property, not just the usual real estate, to the outfitting of the new crusade, over and above everyday taxes. There was one notable exception. Crusaders were exempt from the new tax, undoubtedly prompting energetic preparations from many who might otherwise have preferred to sit this one out. However intense, Plantagenet impatience to leave for the Holy Land was checked by new trouble in the Aquitaine. Philip Augustus was a key provocateur, taking advantage of so many distractions to snatch a Plantagenet castle in the frontier territory of Berry, something of a no-man's land between Aquitanian and Capetian borders. Wars among the barons, counts, dukes, and kings in that time and place were virtually a way of life, fought for centuries before the Plantagenets arrived on the scene, and then fought just as vigorously once they had. Sometimes you went to war because you were tired of paying taxes. Sometimes you could get a war going simply by suspecting that someone was going to do something nasty to you in the future. Sometimes the key event was a war between your liege lords, which forced you to choose between them, thereby marking you and the rest of your family as traitors in at least one notable's mind. If nothing more immediate presented itself, mildewed antagonisms from earlier generations could be resurrected, such as the age-old struggle for supremacy between Aquitaine and Toulouse. Such episodes weren't hard to come by, given the interlocking spiral of feudal claims. One historian has identified no less than 5 individuals to whom even a simple knight could owe fealty. Given the high likelihood that one of the 5 would be at odds with another every few years, the only time our poor knight could perhaps avoid seriously offending someone more powerful than himself would be posthumously. In this complex world where multiple pledges of fealty were so often so highly conflicted, it was child's play to introduce the idea that any given nobleman had been tricked, lied to, cheated, and/or betrayed. Rumors, hot and fascinating, filled all the voids in this world where real evidence and actual facts were slow to arrive. Philip Augustus was particularly good at planting suspicion in susceptible minds, and one of the most susceptible belonged to ostensibly rugged Richard. Philip and Richard had become allies and friends, reportedly eating from the same dish and sleeping in the same bed. Philip could pour several cups of wine for himself and his friend and just begin to muse aloud. "So, your father still refuses to grant you the inheritance due to you after your brother's death. For that matter, maybe your father wants to give your older brother's inheritance to your younger brother. Maybe you're supposed to become your younger brother's vassal. Maybe your father incited the Count of Toulouse to fight you, hoping you'd be killed. So, in the violent years 1187 and 1188, when everyone should have been setting out to recapture Jerusalem, French and English knights fought one another across the Aquitaine instead. We can get a sense of the war's intensity from a piece of parchment that was once part of a document sent by fast courier from Henry to William Marshall, saying, "Come to me fully equipped as soon as you can, with as many knights as you can get." There's also an old eyewitness account that can still chill with the reality of what these fights among princes did to ordinary people's lives.
All is in tumult. The peasants, having just come out to the fields, turn back, uttering loud cries. The shepherds gather their flocks and drive them toward the neighbouring woods in the hope of saving them. The incendiaries set the villages on fire, and the foragers come and sack them. The terrified inhabitants are either burned or led away with their hands tied to be held for ransom. Everywhere bells ring the alarm. A surge of fear sweeps over the countryside. Wherever you look, you can see helmets glinting in the sun, pennons waving in the breeze, the whole plain covered with horsemen. Money, cattle, mules and sheep are all seized. The smoke billows and spreads. Flames crackle. Windmills no longer turn. Chimneys no longer smoke. Briars and thorns grow where villages stood.
It was stupidly, horridly wasteful, ruining lives while accomplishing virtually nothing, killing and wounding men, and using up money that should have been en route to the Holy Land. Even at treaty sessions, tempers were at a boil. There is a story that a Welsh archer loyal to the Plantagenets deliberately shot an arrow into a French soldier's head from an arm's length away during one negotiation. Furious Philip, in turn, had the magnificent Gisor's elm cut down. The symbol of centuries of treaty conferences, survivor of centuries of storms, until this one. We've come to the end of our story for the time being. I am Beckett Arnold, narrating from the book Lion's Forge, adapted for us by the author Karen Markle-Knabb. Thank you to Francis Butt for voicing our introduction and so much more. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating, follow our channel, and share us with your friends. Most importantly, please join us again August 19th for the next episode of Lion's Forge, available everywhere you get your favorite podcasts, including on YouTube with video episode trailers. Visit us on Facebook, where you can ask questions, leave reviews, and interact with me. Until next time, thank you for listening.